China has shifted $8 trillion in assets. That sum is more than the entire yearly economic output of Germany. It surpasses the total annual production of Japan. It is larger than the combined gross domestic product of every nation in Africa. This was not accomplished through a single dramatic announcement. It was achieved by a subtle, synchronized realignment involving reserves, overseas holdings, trade transactions, and the foundational systems of international finance. If this seems unexciting, that is by design. History's most transformative financial maneuvers often appear mundane right until the system strains under new pressures, and everyone comprehends that the fundamental rules have been rewritten. Currently, two narratives are spreading online. The first is sensationalist fear-mongering. It predicts a definite collapse of Western markets by a specific impending date. That is not the analysis I am presenting. The second narrative is based on recognizing historical and strategic patterns. It involves observing how leverage builds silently, how alternative systems are constructed, and how economic interdependence can be weaponized when diplomatic relations sour. This second narrative is grounded in reality. It can be quantified and tracked. For investors, business leaders, or anyone safeguarding their future, this is the critical perspective to grasp. A consistent four-stage pattern emerges whenever an ascending economic power confronts an entrenched financial order. The centuries, nations, and technologies change, but the choreography remains identical. Four stages, in the same sequence, following the same inherent logic. Applying this sequence to the current U.S.-China dynamic reveals we are no longer at the beginning. We are not even at the second stage. We are profoundly embedded in stage 3, a discrete phase where the challenger constructs escape routes, while the reigning power continues as if the status quo will last indefinitely. Allow me to outline this pattern. Not the simplified version from economics textbooks, but the version visible only when analyzing state power, global trade, and financial infrastructure. There are 4 stages, always in the same order, and when the cycle completes, the transition is never smooth. Stage 1 establishes mutual dependence. Two major economies become deeply interlinked. Trade expands dramatically. Cross-border investment becomes routine. Supply chains integrate seamlessly. Wealth is generated on all sides. Political leaders champion cooperation. Economists publish theories arguing that conflict is illogical due to the immense mutual costs. This statement is echoed in every historical epoch. We are too interconnected to confront one another. It always sounds intelligent and contemporary. It is invariably the sentiment repeated just before the system fractures. Stage 2 is the period of lopsided buildup. One side quietly amasses strategic buffers while the other grows complacent. Nations with surpluses accumulate reserves, deepen industrial capabilities, and create options. Nations with deficits accumulate debt, vulnerability, and reliance. The transition is so gradual it doesn't feel alarming. It feels like ordinary economic activity. That is precisely why it is effective. By the time the dominant power recognizes the leverage has moved, the shift is already complete. To gain an advantage in this environment, you need a systematic approach to investing. This is the reason I developed a dedicated platform for strategic wealth building. Members receive weekly, in-depth analysis on specific opportunities. They also get a practical, step-by-step framework for accumulating assets. In an era where the rules can shift abruptly, those with a deliberate and resilient system are positioned to succeed. You can find more details in the link provided. Stage 3 is strategic reconfiguration. This is when the challenger maintains a public facade of cooperation while methodically restructuring its position behind closed doors. Actions include diversifying currency reserves, creating parallel payment networks, securing supply chains, locking in long-term commodity access, forging bilateral currency agreements, and extending influence along crucial trade routes. Stage 3 does not resemble an overt assault. It looks like prudent financial management. It appears to be standard risk mitigation. It seems insignificant until you realize it is preparation for a future where cooperation may give way to coercion. Stage 4 is the application of calculated pressure. If relations deteriorate to this point, the challenger doesn't need military victory. They activate the levers they have built. They turn decades of cultivated dependency into a political tool. They inflict targeted financial strain to achieve geopolitical aims. The established power then learns that its deep debt, consumption-driven economy, and fragile supply networks are not defenses, they are points of acute vulnerability. Let's examine this pattern through historical examples. First, Britain and Germany in the decades before World War I. Britain was the global hegemon. London was the world's financial heart. The British pound enjoyed unparalleled international use. Britain's dominance appeared unshakable, a permanent feature of the world order. Germany was rapidly ascending, industrializing, expanding its manufacturing base, and building strategic resources. Stage 1 was clearly present: deep commercial links and extensive trade. Political and business elites were convinced economic ties made conflict illogical. The press discussed an era of peace through commerce. Statesmen spoke of lasting partnership and stability. Stage 2 was the quiet accumulation of strength by the rising power, while the dominant power reaped the rewards of the existing system. In the pre-war years, nations focused on monetary resilience, understanding that in a crisis, trust functions as currency. Specific portfolio adjustments varied, but the strategic principle is eternal. If you believe a fracture is possible, you reduce your exposure to your rivals' financial systems and build buffers to survive a liquidity crisis. Then, a shock occurs. When conflict erupts, currency convertibility, free capital movement, and normal finance can disappear instantly. Markets do not adjust calmly, they freeze. The dominant power might prevail militarily, but the global financial center of gravity can still shift as crises compel new arrangements and dependencies. The key lesson is not that one action causes everything. It is that Stage 1 creates dependency, Stage 2 shifts leverage, Stage 3 prepares the instruments of pressure, and Stage 4 is where financial infrastructure becomes a contested battlefield. Second, consider Europe and Russia from 2000 to 2022. After the Cold War, Europe forged deep commercial ties with Russia, centered on massive natural gas and oil imports. Industrial Europe thrived on reliable, affordable energy. Russia prospered from steady revenue. Stage 1 cemented profound interdependence. European leaders gave speeches declaring that trade made war unthinkable and energy partnerships guaranteed peace. The same optimistic statement in a new century. In Stage 2, Russia built up its financial reserves, worked to reduce its own vulnerabilities, and explored alternatives to Western-dominated financial messaging. Many Western analysts dismissed these steps as symbolic, arguing they couldn't replace systems like SWIFT. During peaceful periods, these doubts seemed valid, but Stage 2 is not about calm periods, it's about preparing for stress. Stage 3 saw Russia, as tensions mounted, subtly adjusting its posture, redirecting some trade, rebalancing reserves, and building contingency plans. Meanwhile, Europe's dependency increased, not due to folly, but because it was economically efficient. The cheapest energy source wins in peacetime. That is the strategic trap. Efficiency can masquerade as strength until it suddenly reveals itself as critical fragility. Now, return this framework to China. This is where online discussion often distorts pattern recognition into alarmist prophecy. The exaggerated version claims an inevitable total collapse is coming. The more nuanced, accurate version is that China has spent decades amassing strategic leverage and in recent years has been actively building financial and systemic options. Options are crucial because they reduce vulnerability to sanctions, asset seizures, and the infrastructure of Western finance. This is the definitive signature of Stage 3 behavior. Stage 1 for the US and China spanned roughly 1990 to 2010, an era of integration. China was brought into the global economic system. Global supply chains and manufacturing relocated. Technology and knowledge flowed. corporate profits boomed, Western consumers enjoyed low-cost goods. China achieved explosive growth, employment, and capital investment. All parties believed the relationship was permanent because all parties benefited. This is precisely how Stage 1 always feels. Stage 2, from approximately 2010 to 2020, was the phase of accumulation. China built the world's largest foreign exchange reserves, expanded its industrial dominance across key sectors, and extended influence through global infrastructure projects, financial institutions, and trade networks. Whether one views these initiatives positively or negatively is beside the point. The point is the accumulation of leverage. When one nation becomes the central node in global supply chains and gains influence over settlement systems, commodity processing, and trade routes, that constitutes leverage that can potentially be activated. Stage 3, from around 2022 to the present, is repositioning. Consider U.S. Treasury bonds. China has been gradually reducing its reported holdings. This does not imply a fire sale is imminent. It does signify a deliberate reduction in one specific category of risk, excessive exposure to the debt market of a potential rival in an age where sanctions and asset freezes are standard geopolitical tools. Next, observe payment systems. China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS, is a yuan-based settlement network backed by its central bank. It is designed to facilitate international yuan transactions and decrease reliance on traditional offshore clearing channels. This is not a prototype, it is an operational system. It doesn't need to dethrone SWIFT globally to be significant. It only needs to reach a scale where it serves as a credible alternative and a bargaining chip. Now examine the digital yuan. The digital currency does not need to become the world's reserve currency to have impact. It only needs to demonstrate at scale that a major economy can operate a modern payment network with different governance and can expand it rapidly if necessary. Viewed holistically, the Stage 3 posture becomes clear. Encouraging international use of the yuan, expanding bilateral settlement corridors, deepening central bank swap lines, and reducing overdependence on any single foreign financial pipeline. This is not a covert plot. This is a visible and logical policy stance that aligns perfectly with the historical pattern. And, notably, there is gold. Central banks worldwide have been net buyers of gold in recent years. China has officially reported increasing its gold reserves. The precise totals beyond official disclosures are unknown, so any claims of secret stockpiles are speculative. However, the directional trend, accumulating gold, is textbook Stage 3 behavior. Reducing counterparty risk, enhancing monetary sovereignty, and holding an asset that isn't someone else's liability. So, what constitutes the $8 trillion move? It is not one transaction. It is an estimate, aggregating several components: shifts in reserve composition, decreased exposure to certain Western assets, changes in how trade is settled, the expansion of alternative financial infrastructure, and long-term strategic investment commitments. The exact figure can be debated, and it should be. The more vital question concerns intent. Is this merely prudent portfolio management, or is it preparation for a world where finance is an arena of state competition? This leads to the most alarming claim circulating online, that China issued a blanket order in late 2023 for its state-owned enterprises to fully divest from Western markets within 3 years, implying a forced liquidation of trillions by late 2026. I have not found verified, authoritative documentation confirming an order of this magnitude and specificity. Many reports ultimately trace back to analysis and social media amplification, not official government decrees. This distinction is critical. A verified, forced divestment decree would be a glaring Stage 3 warning signal, putting a political deadline on financial decoupling. Without concrete verification, basing one's entire worldview on this single claim is risky. Yet, even without it, the repositioning narrative remains valid and evidence-based. The reduction in treasury holdings, the growth of alternative payment rails, the scaling of digital currency and policy pushes for Yuan internationalization are all measurable facts. This is the core concept most miss. Stage 3 is not about a single event. It is a strategic posture defined by the deliberate accumulation of options. And when a nation possesses options, it can both endure external pressure and, if it chooses, exert pressure in novel and potent ways. Therefore, what could Stage 4 entail if it were ever to materialize? This is not a prediction, but an exploration of potential instruments that could be utilized if political calculations changed. The first instrument is inducing financial strain through market mechanisms. If a major holder accelerates selling in sensitive debt markets, it can drive yields higher, tighten liquidity, and force policymakers into difficult choices. For the U.S., significantly higher yields increase government refinancing costs and tighten financial conditions for housing, businesses, and stock valuations. The central bank can intervene, but every intervention carries consequences. An important nuance: a large seller also damages the value of its own remaining holdings if it sells too aggressively, and global investor reactions are unpredictable. Therefore, this is more plausible as a tool of sustained pressure rather than a single catastrophic event. The second instrument is targeted supply chain friction. The most potent approach is not a total embargo, which would unite global opposition. It is the selective application of administrative delays, export license reviews, customs inspections, environmental audits, or prioritizing domestic needs. Individually, each action appears bureaucratic. Collectively, they can create shortages, deplete inventories, and crush profit margins. Because critical components like semiconductors, pharmaceutical ingredients, or battery minerals are embedded in countless products, even minor selective friction can cause disproportionate economic pain. Now consider 3 pervasive and dangerous myths that lull people into complacency by mistaking the current moment for a permanent condition. Myth 1: mutual economic dependence guarantees peace. Reality: interdependence creates incentives for stability, but it also constructs the architecture for potential coercion. It can reduce the likelihood of conflict, but it simultaneously becomes the most efficient weapon available if leaders decide the costs of confrontation are acceptable. Myth 2: the US dollar's position is inassailable. Reality: reserve currency status is not a natural law. It is a dynamic arrangement built on trust, deep and liquid markets, legal predictability, and a credible promise not to weaponize the financial system arbitrarily. When that system is frequently used for sanctions, it projects power, but it also gives the world a compelling reason to build escape routes. This doesn't mean an imminent dollar collapse, but it does ensure a gradual, motivated erosion of its monopoly. Myth 3: America can pivot and adapt instantly. Reality: in some areas, like military response, speed is possible. In rebuilding complex industry and supply chain capacity, it is not. Constructing semiconductor foundries, restarting production of essential pharmaceuticals, expanding processing for critical minerals, and reviving broad-based manufacturing takes years, if not decades. Military might can't instantly produce missing components. Innovation can't scale without physical supply chains. And high debt levels may not feel constraining until the cost of servicing that debt rises sharply. So, how should you process this analysis without succumbing to paralysis or doom? Emulate sophisticated risk managers. Distinguish between certainty, probability, and potential impact. Construct a plan that does not rely on any single prediction being perfectly accurate. Adopt this practical mindset. Instead of asking, "Will Stage 4 happen in 2026?" ask, "What would I wish I had started doing today if a major systemic shock occurred within the next few years?" Then implement the parts of that answer that are prudent and beneficial, even if the shock never materializes. That is the essence of building resilience.
First, acknowledge that the coming years will likely see greater volatility than the past decade, as finance and geopolitics become increasingly intertwined. Trade restrictions, export controls, sanctions, and industrial policy are now standard, not exceptional. Volatility naturally clusters around these tools. Second, audit your personal or professional exposures. Identify any investments, business models, or sectors that depend on single-source supply chains, vulnerable trade routes, or the assumption of perpetually easy global liquidity. You need not sell everything in panic, but you must understand what you own and how it would withstand increased friction. Third, seek out the beneficiaries of de-risking. When the world prioritizes security over pure efficiency, new winners emerge. These are often companies enabling redundancy, domestic manufacturing, industrial automation, energy and grid infrastructure, secure logistics, cybersecurity, and critical material supply chains. A regime shift creates unglamorous essential winners because the world begins to pay a premium for resilience. Fourth, diversify your foundational assumptions. Do not anchor your entire strategy on one baseline scenario, like perpetually low interest rates, eternal dollar dominance, or the assumption that China will never jeopardize its export economy. Build optionality into your own position. Favor quality balance sheets, assets with real cash flow and pricing power, and consider geographic diversification where it aligns with your risk tolerance. Fifth, monitor signals, not headlines. To build an effective dashboard, track these slow-moving indicators: the trend in reported foreign holdings of U.S. debt, the transaction volume on alternative payment systems like CIPS, policy statements encouraging non-dollar trade, the frequency of new export controls, and the expansion of currency swap lines. These metrics reveal whether Stage 3 is deepening. Also, listen for a linguistic shift in corporate earnings calls. When executives seriously discuss dual sourcing.
However, dismissing the underlying pattern recognition would be a grave error. The direction of travel is unambiguous. The world of international finance is becoming more strategic, more fragmented, and more politicized. If a Stage 4 scenario ever unfolds, it will not arrive labeled as such. It will manifest as a seemingly routine market adjustment, a technical trade regulation, a sudden jump in borrowing costs, a minor supply hiccup that cascades into a major shortage, or a payment processing delay that escalates into a diplomatic incident. By the time consensus forms that a fundamental shift is underway, the most significant financial repricing will have already occurred. Thus, the essential question is this: are you structuring your investments, your business, and your financial life as if the world will remain perfectly integrated, predictable, and stable? Or are you positioning for a world that is growing more fragmented, strategic, and more susceptible to abrupt shocks? That foundational choice, how you build your portfolio, manage your business risks, and plan for the future, will determine whether a future shock is merely a concerning news story you observe or a transformative event that threatens your financial security. If there is interest, a follow-up analysis could delve into greater specificity. It could examine which sectors are most vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, which industries stand to gain from reshoring and redundancy spending, and how to construct a watch list for resilience without retreating into unproductive fear. A final, critical reminder: this is not financial advice. It is an exercise in scenario analysis and strategic thinking. Use it to ask more informed questions, to stress test your assumptions, and to broaden your perspective, not to make reckless bets based on a single predicted timeline. Remember, the ultimate goal is not to perfectly forecast one date or event. The goal is to avoid being fragile. If the world continues on a relatively stable path, a resilient position means you still own quality assets that can compound wealth. If the world encounters rough seas, such a position means you are not forced into distressed sales at the worst possible moment. That is how you not only survive potential disruptions, but continue to prosper. If you found this framework valuable and want the practical, applied blueprint, what breaks, what endures, and where opportunity hides when others are fearful, please subscribe and enable notifications. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to continuing this analysis.